access
I wanted to just begin by giving you a sense of what this is. This is my attempt to, I love data. I love really dry research. I get really excited about it, but most people don't, okay? And what I'm trying to do here is take a lot of historical data, social science data, and economics research. I'm trying to take all of that and weave it into a story that folks can relate to. We think in story. So I'm going to be telling a story, but as I'm telling that story, I'm going to be citing a lot of different research. And the point of this is so that we can really place the school-to-prison pipeline where it belongs, both historically and understand and see the full system in which it's embedded. Okay? So, great. So I'm going to begin with talking a little bit about the long arc. Okay, I'm really going to be spending a lot of time right here up front talking about the last 45 or so years, since the early 70s. Part of the key piece of this is understanding the school-to-prison pipeline that's happening against a radically changing background. The world was changing a lot in the 45 years that exclusionary discipline has sort of risen in prominence. Okay. There are four main changes that I want to talk about. Okay? The first is structural shifts in the economy. What this is about is deindustrialization, computerization, automation, everything that moved a lot of manufacturing jobs out of this country and that automated a lot of jobs that involve repetitive skills, repetitive low-skill jobs. Now, a great way to kind of capture the meaning of this is in 1970, the biggest employer, and usually when I actually have people in flesh, what's the biggest employer in 1970? Biggest employer at that point was GM, General Motors. Okay, so think about the kind of job that you could get at GM. Think in particular about the kind of job you could get without a college education, right out of high school. Today, the largest employer in the U.S. is Walmart. Once again, think about what you get in a Walmart job. Now, a key thing about this shift is that there were huge macro forces happening that shifted the economy and changes how things were going. But there are also very specific policy choices that were made in the United States that determined how come this particular change drove so much inequality that we're going to see showing up in the school-to-prison pipeline. Okay? In particular, all the jobs didn't leave this country. A lot couldn't leave this country or be automated, and they were service jobs. But whereas those manufacturing jobs were heavily unionized, the service jobs were not, so they're incredibly low paying. A number of key policy decisions and political decisions were made during the last 45 years that undermine the strength of unions in huge ways. Now, it's good to note here that when we bring race into the picture, remember that African Americans in particular had not really got access to membership in the unions or the good jobs that were provided in that post-war period until about the early mid-60s, late 60s. Now, essentially, we get access to this economy that's creating a lot of economic equality right when the structure of that collapses, right? And the jobs start leaving. The structural shifts in the economy, so that's happening over time. We're getting increasingly hard to be someone who has a high school diploma and less and make a living wage. The same exact time that this is happening, jobs are leaving, well-paying jobs are leaving, mass incarceration rises, okay? And its early kind of introduction onto the scene is the war on drugs, right? 1972, Dixon announces the war on drugs, right? So remember, we no longer have good jobs. We have a lot of folks now who have a high school diploma or less. And suddenly we begin to criminalize a broad range of activities, in particular issues that we now understand as health issues like substance abuse. And we introduce new, really aggressive forms of policing, like broken windows. and all of the war on drug techniques that essentially would criminalize a whole neighborhood, right? Often based on the color of the skin of the folks that are living. So what mass criminalization was driven by was not so much an increase in crime, although in the 70s and first part of the 80s, you did see crime going up and up. But then crime dropped and dropped after the mid-90s, but incarceration continued, right? What it was being driven by was that for the same offense, we had enacted all of these tough on-law crimes which increased the punishment, which made it more likely that you were arrested, more likely that you were convicted, and once convicted, you were in jail, prison longer, okay? The first thing that happened is connected to these first two. And I call it here the growth of disadvantaged families. What I'm talking about here specifically is the massive growth in single-parent families, especially among young people, children in poverty, okay? Now, this is directly connected to the last two changes, right? A great book written by, a great book called Love's Labor's Lost, Andrew Sherlin. He's looking at the history of this traditional family, the two parents at home with the father working and the mother doing uncompensated labor, taking care of kids, cooking, all of that stuff, right? And showing that in the wide span of history, from the middle of the 19th century to now, there's only been a very short time where that family actually flourished, you know, where more than, say, half of families were like that. And that period was after the war up into 1970, right? It was during this tiny slice of time when we actually had an economy in which not just that all boats are rising, the poorest and middle-class people were increasing how they were doing economically at a faster rate than those top. That created jobs where someone who had a high school diploma or less could get married and have only one parent work, the other one stay home, take care of children. When those jobs disappeared, guess what? That family began to disappear. Same time, think how this is playing out in communities of color. You also, at that same time, have mass incarceration happening. So suddenly you're just getting tons and tons of folks into the criminal justice system and incarcerated for a long period. Now, if you're getting married and you're looking for a man to marry, right, they're going to be in really short supply. They're going to be incarcerated or unemployed. It's this idea that they're not going to be able to support a family even in a two-earner sense, okay? So all of this combined with shifts in morals and what was acceptable and what was unacceptable to create this explosion of single-parent families. Then finally, all of this stuff, all of this disadvantage was being increasingly concentrated in certain neighborhoods, okay? So before 1970s, there had been neighborhoods that were all black or all brown, okay? But something specific happened in the 70s, emerged in the 70s, that hadn't been around before. Now, you had all brown or black neighborhoods, but these neighborhoods were all black and brown and primarily poor. In other words, what happened is before you had racially segregated neighborhoods, but they were socioeconomically diverse. You had a middle class there. Well, the middle class left, right? And what you got was neighborhoods of concentrated poverty or disadvantage where 30 to 40% of the folks are living in poverty. All of that's happening, right, during these 45 years. There's major shifts that are going on. And again, reminding folks, we're not going to talk in this presentation too much, the key policy decisions show up every single one of these circles. Now, against that big background, that's what's happening in the life, in the world of working class people of color and their families, their children, right? Two things go on during that same 45 years. We're going to talk about today the rise of exclusionary school discipline. So what's exclusionary school discipline? What exclusionary school discipline is any punishment that a child receives that takes them out of learning time, okay? So we commonly think of out-of-school suspension, right, or expulsion, right? But I'm going to include in here things like in-school suspension or detention where there's no learning going on, right? If it's just custodial, if kids are getting marginalized and pushed out into environments, say they're going to an alt school and they only have to be there, an alternative school, they only have to be there 2 hours a day versus the 6 or 7 that they had. All of those things are decreasing learning time and excluding students from the learning experience. So that's what I'm which schools and districts would be judged primarily on their test scores. Now, what it didn't provide is it didn't provide strong accountability for high school graduation or the opposite of that, dropout, or a strong disincentive to pushing out kids. In other words, well, if you're going to be judged based on your test scores, and no one's looking to see if if the lower performing kids are leaving your school or dropping out or being transferred to alt school, then that creates a perverse incentive to just keep on letting them go, keep the kids who are achieving. And remember, because the standards-based accountability system was not about, at that point, it wasn't about growth. It was basically you needed to meet this proficiency marker, okay? So what that meant is, you weren't getting any credit from taking a kid who was very, very behind to being kind of behind. You didn't get any credit for that if they didn't cross that. All the focus was on the kids who were just below that basic proficiency line to push them over. And so the kids who were struggling were being pushed out. What happened? What did we get? We got a system which was systematically pushing young people from the most disadvantaged families and neighborhoods out of the school system and into the criminal justice system. And this, in turn, hastened and reinforced an intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. So we're going to talk about how a lot of policy decisions were made here that set this in motion. But once it was set in motion, we're going to talk about how in this system there are all of these kind of negative feedback loops that become self-perpetuating, okay? First, let's talk a little bit about exclusionary discipline, and let's talk about school suspension, which is what most people think of when we talk about exclusionary school discipline. Now, these are national rates of out-of-school suspension. I'm going to look from 1972 to 2012, which is kind of going to be our mantra in terms of the bookends, right? Now, when we look at this blue line right here, this is the percent of students in a given school year, that year, who were suspended out of school one or more times. So in other words, in 72, out of 100 white kids, 3 white kids have been suspended one or more times. And one could have been suspended once for 2 days, and the other 2 were each suspended 10 times. It doesn't give you a sense of how many times. It just means you at least had one experience where you were told you could not come back to school. Okay. So you can see here that we go from 3%, and you see the movement up to 5%, right? And there it sort of plateaus off. So it almost doubled for white. This is Latinos. Latinos start in 72, 73 exactly the same as white, with the 3% of students suspended out of school over a school year. And you see it more than doubles, and we hit 7% by the 2000s, right? And you see that space between the yellow and blue, that's what we call the school discipline gap. And you see it getting larger, that black space getting larger. This is African American, okay? African Americans started at 6%. So in 72, they were being suspended at 2 times the rate, 3 percentage points more than white students, right? And that goes all the way up to 16% by 2012, okay? So this is nearly a tripling. And you got a difference here. You see the 3 percentage point difference between whites at 3% and blacks at 6 points. Balloons, right, to 11 percentage point difference in 2012. So the disparity, that gap is increasing. So what's behind these overall patterns? Both the overall increase in out-of-school suspension and the growing disparity. So a key piece of this is this emergence of zero tolerance, this growth of zero tolerance. And one of the things that we're going to talk a little bit about is how the patterns that we see in out-of-school suspension are an echo of what I just put up there, which are, that's the national incarceration rate, state and federal prisons, okay? So what the argument we're putting forward is that schools in a lagged way took on the punitive policies of the criminal justice system, okay? And one of the key ones is this zero tolerance piece. Zero tolerance is actually something that comes from the war on drugs in the 80s, right? Zero tolerance was adopted in the 90s, and with it also the emergence of federal grant programs, which basically created a financial incentive to get police and metal detectors in schools, right? So a lot of this had been was initiated around school shootings and safety concerns. But when you look at where these police and where the heavy sort of policing of schools happened, it was mostly not in the kind of community where something like Columbine happened, a suburban community with mostly middle and upper middle class kids, but in cities with mostly black and brown kids. Okay. The school police, and another pattern here that is an echo of what was going on in the criminal justice system, which is important to consider. So we talked about zero tolerance, echoing war on drugs. Well, there also was a move to more aggressive policing. It's called a lot of things, called quality of life policing, called broken windows policing, called order maintenance policing, right? One of the tactics involved in that is stop and frisk. The idea here is that you got to sweat the small stuff, right? That any sign of disorder in a community is kind of an encouragement to criminals to do bad things, right? So what it means is that you very aggressively enforce misdemeanors. You very aggressively enforce things like open containers, drinking in open containers, littering, all of these types of minor offenses. So that all of that gets swept in. At the same time that we're doing that, we were also increasingly widening the net of what was a felony, right? Then a felony means it's an offense that if convicted, you go to prison, right? And we also were saying once you are convicted of this felony, the discretion that a judge has in terms of how much time you do is radically cut back, and we've got to have these mandatory minimums which said if you have this type of drug offense, you must get this time. One of the things that's driving this uphill line in the green here. So in other words, all of the stuff that before 1970 and the rise of tough on crime would be considered misdemeanor, to be more minor, you wouldn't be likely to encounter a policeman, suddenly you were. Well, the echo in the school system was that suddenly it wasn't that you were just suspended out of school if you got in a major fight with someone and as someone was hurt, but now you were getting out of school suspensions for dress code violations, for refusing to take off your baseball cap in class, for a bunch of stuff that basically falls in the category of disorder and, you know, the incredibly subjective category of disrespect. But all of that stuff suddenly became punishable by out-of-school offense, by out-of-school suspensions. And then on top of that, when you layer police into this, just think through this, right? When you layer the police, like the incident that we saw in South Carolina recently, those same disorder, disrespect, defiance infractions that are all, are also the developmentally appropriate behavior of teenagers. Not that it's not problematic or it doesn't need consequences, but it's part of teenagers being teenagers. And the school system up until the mid-70s was dealing with it in a different way, right? Now, not only might you get suspended for 2 or 3 days out of school, the police might be called. And once the police come in, that same behavior, which is eye-rolling, not listening, not following orders, becomes a valid reason to be arrested, and it becomes a valid reason for the use of force, just as soon as that policeman is there. So a whole category, giant swaths of behavior now became criminalized. Before we jump into actually mapping the pipeline, I want to spend a little time looking at the latest federal data. So this is, we're going to look at suspensions here. This is the same data that we talked about in 1972. We're looking at the percentage of students that were suspended 1 or more time out of school. Doesn't include in school. This is nothing about how many times they got suspended. It means at least they had 1 day where they can come back to school, something they did. Okay. So let's look at what these numbers look like in 11-12. This is, we have here African American, Latino, white. For California, we have a much broader array. I want to just point out really clearly that Native Americans, the rates are through the roof. They're not on here because of some methodological issues, but it's really important. If I were able to use good California data to do this, you would see Native Americans and Pacific Islanders is secondary students. So for African American, we go from 8% to fully 23% of black secondary students suspended one or more time over the course of the school year in 11-12 in the United States. Latino, over 1 in 10, white 7%. And you see here the 7% to 11%, the 4 percentage point difference. A gap emerges when you look at secondary school for Latinos. And that gap is largely covered up when we throw in the elementary numbers together with the secondary numbers. This is male secondary students. Okay? So African American 28%, Latino 14%, white 9%. And this is male secondary students with disabilities. Fully over 1 in 3 African American male secondary students with disabilities were suspended 1 or more times in 11-12. Okay? 1 in 4 Latino, 16% of white male students with disabilities. Now, when we saw this data, we were surprised, and we were surprised for a number of reasons. The foremost being, these kids who have disabilities, the kind of disabilities we're talking about are special education categories, right? So all of these kids have IEPs. They've been designated as special education, requiring special education services. So they have a whole chunk of money and services that goes specifically to them to address that, okay? Right? That means each of them should have a behavioral plan. There should be a lot of stuff going on, especially since there are a number of these categories, whether it has to do with hyperactivity or it has to do with emotional disability. That there are behavioral manifestations, behavioral things that could show up in the classroom that are really about their disability, right? So they're supposed to have behavioral plans and services and everything, and they also have additional due process protections. That is, they are not allowed to be suspended for something that is a manifestation of their underlying disability. But, and this is the big but, that only kicks in once you hit 10 days suspended. So what you're seeing here, right, is that you have tons of suspensions probably happening specifically to those students for whom that behavior is a manifestation of their disability, right, with not getting the protection that they deserve. And these numbers are incredibly troubling. The final number I want to put up here, this is black women, girls, secondary students with disabilities. It's at 23%. I just want to show something to you, and this is even more marked when we don't look at the disability data, we just look at men and women. But, in this discussion, African American girls, note, they have as high a rate of suspension as Latino boys and white boys. And when you're just looking at gender, actually, African American girls have higher suspension rates than all other boys of color except African American boys. So a lot of times when we talk, I'm very involved in the boys and men of color work, but this is a key blind spot there. What I'm going to do now is skip now to this Prezi. You guys will get these slides. You'll get the Prezi. You'll get everything. So, okay, given that as a background, that's the big background. It's a 45-year story, and here's the snapshot of what's happening. Now let's look at actually the pipeline, okay? This is the school to prison immigrant detention pipeline. Up at the top here, the numbers that I'm putting up, those are ages. So we're going from 5 to 11 to 12 to 17 to 18 to 24 to 25 and up. Now let's begin at the beginning. The school to prison pipeline is actually an institutional handoff, okay? Institutions hand off these young people. It goes from elementary and secondary school. The handoff is to police, then to juvenile justice, to jail, to prison, to the experience of living with a felony record, to intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. So let's begin here. Remember the context, okay, back at the slide with the 4 circles, right? So you have kids coming in from communities of concentrated poverty where there's extensive joblessness and tons of incarceration, where you have lots of single parents trying to raise these kids, right? They're going to come in with toxic stress having affected them in huge ways, right? They come in, they're going to come in and be taught by a teaching force that's overwhelmingly white. Okay? They're coming in with high levels of need, right? And they're in a situation where they're coming in with teachers who are not from the same sort of race or culture from them. What happens here is a conflict happens. The teacher perceives a conflict between teacher and student, okay? At that point, the teacher makes an office referral, okay? Now, when that teacher makes the office referral, they're not just sending that kid out of school. What they're doing is they're sending that kid to the dean, they're sending that kid to the AP, they're sending that kid to the principal. The principal will then make the decision. But what the teacher gets immediately right there is they get the kid, the disruptive kid, out of their classroom. I want to take a moment here and talk a little bit about implicit bias in this, right? You talked about the communities they're coming to, the stuff that the kid may be bringing, why the kid might not be able to sit still, or why the kid might be acting out, right? But I want to also bring into this the reality that that we live in this cultural soup that has created these very powerful implicit associations in our head. A study out of Stanford looking at teachers found basically that they took teachers and they read them a case study, right? And they randomized some of the stories to have a stereotypically black name, some to have a white name or a name associated with white kids. And then they tell the story of, and these are all teachers, you're in class, you're teaching, and some kids getting up doing minor, they're talking to their friends, they're wandering around class, they're doing the kind of minor misbehavior stuff, okay? Then it asks, okay, so how serious did you perceive this? How much did it interfere with your teaching? What kind of consequence would you say was required of this? Okay, so they did it right. The first time, they run through it. This happens once, and then they have it happen again. So it's repeated. The first time the kid does this, there's no difference in how they perceive black or white students. It's the same. They're irritated in the same way. They recommend the same kind of discipline. But the second time, there's a huge shift, okay? The second time it happens, those teachers who got the case study with the stereotypically black name perceive the exact same behavior. Remember, this is the exact same behavior to be more serious, to interfere more with their teaching, and they recommend harsher discipline. Okay, remember, it's the exact same behavior, just different name. They're also more likely to identify those kids as troublemakers, and they're more likely to see this as part of a pattern to be able to imagine themselves suspending that kid again. This pattern happened regardless of the race of the teacher. So white teachers did it, black teachers did it. But that is really just impacting, in addition to everything we've talked about, who ends up with that office referral slip on the way to the principal's office. Now, once they get there, we just talked about how it's so much more likely now than in 1972 that they end up with an out-of-school suspension. So now let's talk about what happens when a kid is suspended out of school. First thing is this decrease, and this is just the no-dub stuff. Like, you're not in school, right? You can't come back for a day, you can't come back for 2 days. A decrease in supervised learning time, right? And it makes perfect sense that if you're not learning, you're going to fall behind, right? Now, what's amazing in the last, I guess it's maybe about 3 years ago, that kind of stuff, even going to the same kind of school in the same kind of district. The only difference is that that kid wasn't suspended. And then they would look at, then they do it statistically, right? But then you follow them and you look at what's the difference then? So this kid's still, if they're both behind, right? They're both behind. One kid is in a school where they suspend a lot when you do this certain thing. The other kid is in a school or has a teacher that doesn't, right? So what they found is that the kid who got suspended was twice as likely to have to repeat a grade just as a result of that suspension, and twice as likely to drop out of high school, right? And remember that this is essentially controlling for all those other factors. So the same time that you experience both less learning and more disengagement in school, there's an increase in unsupervised time. And this is especially for older kids, right? So now you're going to have a young person who was in learning time with a teacher, an adult, now in unsupervised time. And remember the slide that we began with, where they're living. Poor, racially segregated neighborhoods. They're now leading to increased exposure to order maintenance, policing, broken windows policing, and to the community violence that exists among, in particular, young people, but young adults in particular, right? So they're in that setting, which makes it very likely that when they could have been in school, having a consequence for the behavior that may have involved more learning or directly addressing the underlying issues, instead they're in the street in an environment where they're very likely to be harmed or arrested, okay? So this in turn leads to an increase in the chance of arrest. And that same study I told you about out of Texas, same one, found that the kids with all the same stuff, right, the same grades, the same history, blah, 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 in the year after being suspended, they were 3 times as likely to show up in the juvenile justice system than the other kid, right? 3 times as likely, so the independent impact of the suspension was to triple the likelihood of contact with the juvenile justice system. And remember, when you get arrested, get contact with the juvenile justice system, that means you then are also at risk for being incarcerated, right? And if you're a young person incarcerated, it's referred to as being in detention, okay? And guess what? If you're in detention, to being arrested, it has a big impact on school disengagement. In fact, the probability of dropping out of high school increases by 13 percentage points. Not 13%, but 13 percentage points as a result of a stay in being detained. And this is a really amazing study out of Chicago that basically was able to look at, compare kids who all end up arrested and they all end up in juvenile court, and certain judges who were given randomly, assigned randomly, were just more, they had a higher probability of incarcerating kids. They were like the jailers, and others weren't. So they're able to compare what's the chance that you go in there and you're kind of on the fence about whether you would end up detained. And the only difference between it is that one kid has the bad luck to get this judge and one kid has the good luck to get this other judge. And they found this 13 percentage point difference. Now, I think all of us who work in schools or advocate for young people know that the intense challenges that young people face when they leave the juvenile detention, juvenile incarceration system and try to re-engage with school, right? So we know that kids can spend months and months, up to 6 or 7 months, being refused re-enrollment at their school, at a number of different schools, as schools bounce them around, right? So if that kid does manage to reconnect, you can imagine that the feeling inside that young person, the disengagement, the sense of unfairness, and the whole set of new social networks that they now have, all that does is drive this negative feedback loop, right? And I want to point out one thing. You see this orange arrow right in the middle? What that is about is, you know, now that we have such an intense police presence in school, you don't need to be suspended out of school and go through the community violence, aggressive policing route to end up arrested. You can just be arrested directly from the school, right? So that's what that arrow denotes. This negative feedback loop is the first of a number of negative feedback loops that we're going to look at. But what this does is it makes it very likely, that by the time you're 18, two things have happened. The first is that you've dropped out of high school. Okay. Now these two things, this in dropping out of high school here in particular, this is the part of the pipeline that directly connects school and the streets to the prison piece component of that pipeline. Okay. So we know that dropping out of high school doubles to quadruples the probability of going to prison. A little comparison between 1970 and now. In 1970, you were a black male dropout. You faced about a 15% chance of going to prison over your lifetime. So by age 35, 15% of you would have done time. Now, fast forward now today, okay? Same demographic, same education profile, black male dropout, okay? By the time that black male dropout is 35, he faces a 70% chance of going to prison over their lifetime. 70%. In California, that number is 90%. Now, it's the second factor, you'd likely to drop out. Sometimes you're also likely to have been incarcerated in the juvenile justice system, okay? Because you probably have gone around that circle a number of times and are going to end up at some point in detention. We know from that same study out of Chicago that juvenile detention, being incarcerated in the juvenile justice system, has an enormous impact on the probability of being incarcerated as an adult in a prison. I'm not talking about jail. This is basically the probability that you hit 25 in the prison system. Okay? It increased the probability of adult incarceration by 22 percentage points. Again, that's not 22%, that's 22 percentage points. Basically, if you were just in Chicago schools at this time, but 1 in 15 of you end up in prison, right? If you're among the group of kids that ends up incarcerated, nearly 2 out of 3 of you will end up in the adult system. So a huge, huge shift. Now, we know then the dynamics behind, again, those time series that we looked at, a steep increase in incarceration from 1970 to 2010, 430% increase in the number of people in prison, and it was over 800% if we include jail. Now, something that's really crucial here, if you end up arrested, if you're arrested in school, if you're arrested on the street, and especially if you end up with a felony conviction and you don't have papers, you don't have documentation, then you go into the detention system and potentially are deported, okay? There's also been an explosion in the use of detention and deportation. Since 1996, every detention has increased by 500%. Most of you are familiar with the ways that over the last 10 years, local police have been told to basically cooperate with federal folks around immigration, such that, like, you get pulled over for a tail light, they give your name to ICE, and your numbers are run, and you end up in detention. Let's make it clear that detention is prison, okay? It's in other words, literally the same companies that run private prisons in the United States, those are the same groups that the federal government contracts with to run the detention centers. So folks are effectively in prison. Now, if you do have papers or you're a citizen here and you're by this time in the trajectory, right? That just puts you in further distress. So it's not surprising that by the time you get to prison, over half of the people have diagnosable substance abuse issues and 56% have a diagnosable mental health problem. Together, we're looking at least 2/3 with serious behavioral health issues. And then going to prison makes those even worse, right? There's a study that we have now that looks at each additional year in prison produces a 2-year decline in life expectancy. So there's a dose response to prison. And the impact of prison is not just about the time in there, right? Certainly there's terrible medical care. That's why the Supreme Court ordered our numbers in California brought down. There's violence. There's lots of stuff that happens inside, but much of the disadvantage economically, physically, mentally, that accrues after you leave. Because once you leave, you have this new status, this felon status. And in this country, felon status makes all the outlawed old forms of discrimination legal. So all of those old forms of discrimination that our ancestors fought and died for, anti-discrimination in housing, in federal benefits and state benefits, in education, student loans, over and over, all of that is perfectly legal if you're a felon. And in fact, in certain cases, mandated. Now, when you have all of that history that we just talked about behind you, and now you face legal and sometimes mandated discrimination, unsurprisingly increases the probability of low earnings, housing instability, and untreated health problems. And that in turn, right, residential instability, unemployment, and untreated health problems increases the probability of recidivism, right? What does that do? Sends you back to prison. This is the second negative feedback loop that runs and runs until eventually you hit the last feedback loop. This is 2 decades after. This is about how all of that disadvantage that we just traveled through ends up being transmitted from parents to children. A study looked at just this population of folks we're talking about, folks who are high school dropouts who went to prison, looked at 20 years after release from prison, 2 decades after this, fully 75% remained in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, the very bottom of the income distribution, the poorest of the poor, right? So when they looked at similar folks who were high school dropouts and didn't have a felony, about 35% remained in the bottom 20%. So what having a felony does to someone, above and beyond the fact that you don't have a lot of education and that you're dealing with all these health issues, is it just makes the bottom of the income distribution really sticky, really hard to move out of. And if you're stuck down there, right, so are your kids. So stalled social mobility, right, that would mean then that the disadvantage is passed on to your children. And children of incarcerated parents. And for each of these bubbles, there's a stack of research, and I have all the citations for you. So each one adds a bunch of multiple studies. And there's a particularly huge pile of studies underneath this one. Children of incarcerated parents, especially boys, are more likely to display what's called externalizing behavior. What is externalizing behavior? It's acting out, it's aggressive behavior, it's violent behavior. And what happens when kids do that? They get suspended from school. And the cycle goes on again. Finally, having a parent who's incarcerated, suffering from mental illness and or substance abuse, all of these are adverse childhood experiences. And they're associated with an increased risk of morbidity and mortality. These are classic markers of trauma. And folks with these kinds of adverse childhood experiences, one of the things that they're much more likely to be are either victims of or perpetrators of violence, right? Which then feeds back into that community violence piece. So then what are we going to do to take this apart, okay? So in the face of that system, how do we begin to dismantle it? The first piece is what probably most folks would think is reform school discipline and end school push-up. We need to stop, in particular, suspending kids for minor incidents of this behavior, but we also need to address all forms of misbehavior as basically saying, what kind of help does that kid need, or does that teacher need, or does that principal need, right? So there's massive efforts around reforming school discipline and ending school push-out. But if we end school push-out, if we stop having kids push the margin, we need to make sure that the schools they're in are serving them, right? So there's a basic harm reduction of, well, no, you're not on the streets anymore, right? But if you're in a school and you're not learning, then you're still caught in many of these cycles. So we need to seriously transform school climate, build social emotional health, to integrate those things we know work in particular with boys of color, like career prep programs, right? All of this works. In other words, the suspension itself is just a proxy Okay, it's just a proxy measure. The suspension is a proxy measure. We can get rid of suspensions and nothing can change in the school, and we all know that, right? What that suspension is saying, hey, the school climate here is awful. There's really not a sense of belonging. Teachers don't have classroom management skills. It also is saying the kids don't have social emotional skills and they need help building those. It's also saying there's intergenerational trauma happening at the school. It's also saying, hey, there's explicit and implicit bias. If we don't address those root causes, and if we don't connect that to teaching and learning, then we're in trouble. So that needs to happen. In addition to that, we need to think about changing policing practices and expanding youth development employment opportunities. So here, so here, let's contract that web. Let's stop having the policing happen, and then also let's think seriously about how to break the feedback loops involved in community violence. One thing about summer job programs is a great example about the youth development and employment opportunities. For many years, we had these summer job programs, and they're poo-pooed by evaluators like myself because you would say, you got this summer job, but it doesn't really help the kid end up as an adult earning any higher wages. So it was like, no, this doesn't really work. Well, recently they began to look at the impact of summer jobs, not so much on whether, 5 years from now you're making more money, but whether on 5 years from now you're alive. Whether 5 years from now you've been arrested or not. It ends up having a huge impact, okay? So thinking hard about both limiting the punitive stuff going on while radically expanding both youth development and employment opportunities. Then overall on the juvenile justice side, first expand diversion and restorative justice in juvenile justice and criminal justice and reduce reliance on school police, right? So that is absolutely try to keep as many folks out of that system as possible. And then for those folks that do end up in there, get so serious about expanding juvenile reentry services that connect young people back to school. And then even if you're doing that, even if you do all of that stuff, there's always this like prevention thing. We're going to just do the upstream stuff. We don't have to deal with this end. But yes, you do have to deal with this end because this cycle has been going on for 30-odd years, almost 40 years. There are huge numbers of folks at every point in this pipeline, and we have to address all of that. They're an ecosystem. They impact one another. So we need to expand opportunities for disconnected youth to reconnect to school and work. And in terms of the connection between juvenile system and adult system, we need to seriously close youth prisons across the country and, importantly, limit direct file eligibility. And what direct file eligibility is the ability of the prosecutor to take a case and move it from juvenile court into adult court, okay? So this is sending young people to adult jails and prisons to begin to seriously stop that. And then in terms of prison, right, even if we were to stop the inflow, so tons and tons of prison beds full, we need to seriously change that. The way we're going to change that is through reforming draconian sentencing guidelines, killing tough on crime statutes, and reclassifying nonviolent felonies as misdemeanors. This is something in California that we've done through Prop 47, right? But all of that rollback is incredibly important. In addition to that, we're going to need to reform immigration policies, limit local law enforcement's role and control, and stop the massive detention of folks. And then it's not enough. Like, we can actually stop imprisoning people. We can do all of that, but the fact is we have this huge pool of folks who have this felony record attached to them. For the fact that you finished up your parole and that, they'll basically say you have been rehabilitated. Importantly, where those have worked, what they've done is actually taken on, assumed the liability. They've held employers free from being sued because they hired someone with a record and they should have known to do that. So there's lots of opportunities, but all of that is how do we take away the felon status that is already there. The other thing, though, is, again, we can begin to remove the mandated stuff. There's a bunch of stuff in the public realm of mandated discrimination that we can effectively remove, include the restrictions on receipt of public benefits, restrictions in public housing, ban the box for public employment, which is the requirement that you check the box if you've been convicted of a felony, right? And finally, and this is crucially important, it's not enough even just to limit the size of the prisons or shrink the prisons and begin to address some of the discrimination that attaches to felony status. If we don't take that money and we put it back in to reentry supports, including access to subsidized employment, housing, and substance abuse and mental health treatment, we want most reentry supports, but we also want supports for folks who now won't go to prison because those have changed, but still have deep needs. Those needs don't go away. And in fact, this need to reallocate resources away from the criminal justice system into health, education, housing, and jobs is broad. And to be really honest, that's not going to be enough money to deal with the need. You can't, it's important that we get that money. It's important we stop wasting that money on something that hurts our communities. But ultimately, we're going to need to think creatively about how we get even more money. And so right now, all the efforts around Prop 13 and the commercial property tax come to mind. On the intergenerational side, we have a real opportunity here with ACA and the Medicaid expansion, Medi-Cal expansion. For the first time in this country's history, a lot of single adults who don't have custody of their kids, who are poor, to now have health coverage. It's huge. We don't have a system, though, that's been developed or in any way designed to address the needs of those folks. So there's a lot of single adult males, in particular males of color, who are coming into the system with all of this kind of trauma, right? Do we have a system and care and providers in a workforce that's ready to address that? On the very basic level, introducing consistent screenings for those adverse child experiences and beginning to provide trauma-informed care to the parents, to all of these adults that are parents of children who are coming here, is going to be crucially important. But that needs to be coupled with direct care for their kids, because adult adverse childhood experience becomes so quickly the adverse childhood experience of the next generation. At the same time that you're addressing what's gone in their lives, we're thinking about expanding trauma-informed pediatric care and providing intergenerational healing support, and begin to think about how do we break that down. And then finally, we talked about the need for school reform, for school discipline reform. And there's definitely an argument here that's very powerful and potent, which says, you know, the rules and the adults in the system are messed up. They're doing the wrong thing. We need to change them. If we change them, then it's going to be great. Now that is absolutely true, but it's half the story. The other half of the story is because this cycle has been happening for so many decades, and arguably in other forms for centuries, it means that a lot of that structural oppression, it gets under the skin. It's in our bodies, it's in our psyche, it's in our family, okay? That trauma is inside of us. We bring that to the school room, and we actually need to be able to address that too, okay? So we don't want to be over-punishing and being expansive and having a punitive regime, but we don't want to just get rid of that without thinking about what it looks like to really support folks who have survived trauma across generations. That means expanding health-based, school-based health centers, full-service community schools, and trauma-informed care. It's when you couple both of that, you reform school discipline and stop school push-out, and you create robust ways that you support and school districts partner with other systems to address the trauma and its manifestation. That's when we cut that intergenerational piece. So that brings me to the end of this, and I'd like to open for questions.
Great. Thank you, Tia. So this mapping of the pipeline, the suggestions to dismantle it, it was very sobering, but it was also uplifting for, you know, getting the suggestions. It was so educational, and I know I learned extra stuff. So with that, there were a couple of questions that came in, and everyone, please do feel free to use the chat function to ask your questions, and also you can use email as well. Someone had a question about about secondary ages. So when you're speaking about like secondary school age, are you looking at just after elementary, or what are those ages?
Include middle school. So it's basically middle school and high school.
Okay, great. So I guess 7 through 12.
6 through 12.
Oh, 6 through 12. Okay, great. And then there was a question about what are the, I guess, the best ways to, the best practices to address implicit and explicit racial bias among teachers and school staff?
So the number one way to address implicit bias, I mean, well, first of all, implicit and explicit bias are different techniques to deal with different pieces. I'm going to just take this time to just talk quickly about implicit bias, okay? We know that all of the conditions under which teachers work, right, where there's, you know, you're multitasking, you have time limit, you're time limited, it's just that everything about it is exactly the kind of environment you build to maximize implicit bias, right? What we found in terms of what interventions work, so I can, if you email me, I'll send you a deck in which I've kind of outlined, I'll send you slides where I've outlined what we know in terms of the evidence about what works. But at the core of what works at those programs that create change in behavior, right? So they're really changing whether that implicit bias is expressed in behavior, okay? And that are lasting beyond the 10 minutes in the lab or whatever. All of those are ones that build relationships, okay? So essentially, what you do in a school and how you structure, and this is why the principal is so important in this, which is if you have a system in which relationships are encouraged, right? The relationship building work is encouraged. For instance, if you have a great example is restorative justice. So a lot of places are doing restorative justice right now. But unfortunately, what you're seeing a lot is using restorative justice as an alternative to suspension. So the bad things happened, and now remember, you're sent to the principal's office, but then you're just sent to the restorative justice center and you have to have a restorative conference, right? Now the work of restorative justice, the real work of it, the power of it is in the community building circle, right? It's in the use of circles that build relationship and trust throughout the day, not just when bad things happen, right? So everything that you can do to build the connection and the relationship. The evidence is just overwhelming. As soon as we get to know each other and people become three-dimensional, it overrides so many of those implicit associations. So that's the short and insufficient answer, but I can send you slides that have way more citations and examples.
Yes, and we'll definitely make those slides available, as well as the link to where you can access the recorded archived presentation after in a couple of days. The next question was about many students are being sent to the office in order to maintain order for the rest of the students. What can be done with students who are too disruptive in the classroom while the student gets extra support?
It's a great question. I think the important thing that we see really clearly in this cycle is that if you have kids that have deep problems, right, and they're calling out for help, that suspending them or sending them to out of school, to in-school suspension, or just to sit in whole thing happening in our classrooms, it's not like you really get this kind of, the good kids can learn dividend. The way you get that is by expelling kids, and that is illegal, right? You can't do that. Like, and we don't do that. And you can go to private school if you want to do that, but we can build robust systems to do this and that address the underlying issues for kids who have underlying issues, but also to build community, because in the end, we want those kids to understand their responsibility to each other. There's nothing about changing how we do school discipline that's about less consequences. In fact, I think it's about more consequences in many ways, right? It's about really being clear so you understand when you do this. If you're in a restorative circle, for instance, you have to sit there and listen to everyone say, how did that behavior affect you, right? One after another. That is some intense stuff. And then you're going to have to think about how you make that better, right? If there are serious issues going on with that kid, around their family, around trauma, then school can't do this alone, right? They need to be able to bring in folks with the skills and the clinical skills to help young people and their families, right? So these are all of the systems that can be set up to stop relying on something that's just making the situation worse. And so you might not ultimately see that kid in that class, but the police see them on the street, and you will see them 10 years later when they get released. And guess what? If you're still teaching, you'll see their kids when they come back in school, and they're freaking out in kindergarten and first grade. So let's try to pre-configure this and do it differently.
Right. And then there was a question saying, or I guess it was kind of a comment, but teachers today are getting credentialed by online education. How do these programs teach new teachers how to manage a classroom with 30 middle schoolers?
That is, yeah.
Yeah, so I would say also, that's true, but then also, there is a lot of work being done to kind of reform some of and make sure that there is classroom management classroom management happening in teacher credentialing, so that no matter where the teacher is getting credentialed, that there are very clear things about what is positive behavior intervention and support, what is restorative justice, how are you ordering your classroom, so that you're building those relationships with your students and making sure that you're supporting students with all of the different needs. And middle schoolers have so many needs, so we definitely there's definitely a lot of work being done around that here in California. And so that was my preliminary answer.
Yeah. So there's ongoing. There's been a lot of organized efforts to make sure that in the teacher credentialing standards, we get stuff in there that specifically, basically, says that you need to be giving folks training in classroom management. You need to be giving them the training in restorative practices, and that's one place. But the larger point that you're making is real. Like, again, if all of this school reform effort, this school discipline reform effort, like, if what its impact is that you send the kid, you're the teacher, you send the kid to the principal and they send it back. It doesn't help either. Like, unless teachers are given real tools and support in serious ways, right? Unless we have folks that have the training and are getting the respect they deserve from that system to do this hard work, then we're not going to really change this. Like, so much of this really depends heavily on teachers understanding that creation of a school, of a different type of school climate and systems of support and robust supports for them to learn, right, is crucially part of the solution, and that in the midterm to long term, that is about really getting adults and kids pushing in the same direction, right? So you're not having to battle with your kids. They're motivated to learn. You guys are working as a community.
Yeah. So the next question is that someone would like to know of models or organizations who are effectively using robust support systems to undercut the cycle of intergenerational trauma, or at least some concrete strategies.
Cool. So let me go to a slide. Do I still have the can I
yes,
share a slide? Okay,
yes.
cool. So I'll send this out too. But this is just about policy changes, school-level interventions, and teacher-student-level interventions that can stop this part of the pipeline. Okay, so that I'm going to hold on a minute. I'm just going to go to the specific school examples so that we can look at. This is Davidson Middle School. Okay, this is a school in San Rafael that that brought down suspensions from 375 to 45 in a year. At the same time, increased the guy from 743 to 829. And as you can see over here, the folks that gained the most from that, everyone gained API. The white kids gained too, but those that gained the most were Latino, poor English language learners. Davidson is a great example. Karen Juncker is someone there. You can visit there. You can talk with her. She's really powerful. The other example that we hear a lot about is Garfield High School. So Garfield in East Los Angeles basically got rid of suspensions. They went from being a school that had, nearly 700 suspensions in 0809 to 1011, none, and they increased their API by over 100 points, right? Manual Arts and Fremont in LA. Again, this is Manual Arts in East LA. Suspensions go from 598 to 27, and you see API going up at the same time. That's LA's Promise. That's another great example if you want to see people doing, and that's a great, all of these schools. So Garfield did PBIS, okay, did positive behavior intervention supports, and then has most of these places are doing multiple things, right? They're layering the stuff on top of each other. Manual Arts does both PBIS and restorative justice. This is Pioneer High School. This is Fremont High School. So these are some examples of schools where they've done it. If we want to talk about sort of what are the school level interventions, sorry about this. Hold on. These are the proven interventions, okay, that we have data on. The one we know the most about is school-wide positive behavioral supports. Okay, that's the PBIS thing. And what we know about this is the school-wide positive behavioral supports is focused on creating and maintaining school and classroom climates, but really enforce good behavior school-wide and then respond to children engaging in problem behaviors with a tiered structure of intervention and support. So this is kind of that earlier question that we got. But really the focus is on let's put more energy into creating shared norms and also to rewarding good behavior. And instead of all of the energy going to bad behavior, and when the quote-unquote bad behavior arises, thinking hard about what are the skills missing, what are the needs, right? We have tons of very rigorous evaluations showing that this decreases actual misbehavior. You have less misbehavior and less suspensions. Kids feel safer, and you have higher test scores. Social emotional learning is another proven piece. And so this is again, this isn't specifically about, hey, let's bring down suspensions. This is actually focusing on one of the kind of categories of sort of root causes, which is teaching of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision making, so that children can learn to effectively manage their emotions. And a big meta-analysis of like 213 evaluations found that when implemented well, and that goes across all of these, basically social emotional learning decreases behavioral problems, cut the black-white gap in half. And then finally, my teaching partner. My teaching partner is actually this year-long personalized coaching process. Teachers take videotape, do digital video of their classroom, and they have a coach, a web-based coach, who then looks at that. They use a rubric, called the class rubric, kind of like the Danielson's rubric, to talk about all elements of their teaching, right? And the idea here is really about instructional improvement, but one of those categories is relationships and emotional support. So anyway, this has been evaluated and has huge effects on, in particular, increasing test scores among students. And after the year-long coaching, the findings persist for 2 years after that. But what they found out afterwards is they said, hey, let's take a look at suspension. Let's see what it does there. And most of the kind of things I've talked about here, in particular, PBIS and social emotional learning, all of those decrease overall suspensions for everybody, but they don't necessarily get at the disparity. My teaching partner, though, got rid of the gap. It got rid of the cap. And it did that really by focusing really strongly on the interactions that were happening between teachers and students that were filmed, right? What happens is teachers will know that when you get in an escalation loop with students, what's going on? What's happening with these negative feedback loops where everyone's, small things get real big real fast. But it really helps the teacher to kind of reflect and improve their emotional support of particular students, and I really think in the end build those relationships. So it essentially is the only thing we know that eliminated the racial disparity in office referrals, not even in suspensions, but in office referrals, while also creating a 9 percentile increase in test scores. And that's a high-level overview. The final thing, yeah, that's it.
Oh no! Sorry, I was just saying yes, and you were going to say something, but you could.
No, I can keep on going, but let's go to the next question.
All right. Well, there was a question about PTSD, about like how to, are there any studies about, working with those students? And I'm trying to get the exact question, but it says, how many children, particularly in inner cities, are impacted by PTSD? How can they be tested/worked with?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I don't actually have the data on the prevalence at the tips of my fingers. We do know that when the studies that looked at young men of color, in particular young black men in Boston, in particular those that were coming into the emergency room, found levels of PTSD that were higher than those of combat veterans. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to look at PTSD, but also the impact of kind of chronic stress. The idea is those young people who are suffering from complex trauma. So, you can have PTSD because one big horrible thing happens, and there's, and what happens after that? About 1 in 4 people who go through something like that will end up with this collection of symptoms that we call PTSD. But complex trauma has to do when the big awful thing is happening, and a lot of little horrible things are happening, and they're happening over and over and over again, right? And it's that type. So when we think about this is just the RTI response intervention triangle. This is also the PBIS triangle. People are probably very familiar with it, but it's how we think about what we do instead of exclusionary discipline. I want to talk about the orange part, the 5 to 10% of students. These are sometimes called the Tier 3 students, but they're the students who are dealing with things like PTSD. Okay, and this is essential in those schools that are doing this. In particular, in those schools where you're dealing with this concentrated. Okay, so one thing about throughout this presentation, a really important theme has been what happens when we take all the folks that are suffering and keep on concentrating them in these small areas, in certain schools, in certain neighborhoods. So the problem gets exponentially more intense when you have so many folks suffering so much in one place. When we're not, when this suffering isn't more evenly spread, so it can be dealt with in other settings. So in those schools, it's important to partner to provide services to address students. I think one way to think about PTSD is there's 2 kinds of things. So here we're talking about targeted restorative wraparound strategies with family and community as partners, comprehensive individualized success plans, on-campus mental health counseling by school or community-based therapists, social workers, and connecting to external research providers. The idea here is there are two things. There's a trauma-informed approach to teaching, right? So if you're in a school where you have lots of kids dealing with trauma or PTSD, trauma and PTSD, you can teach in ways that don't exacerbate all the stuff they're coming in with. Okay, so they're stress reactive. Okay, they're coming in fight flight all the time, and there's a set of principles and way of teaching that understands that and works to ratchet the level of intensity down and to create an environment in which they can sort of let go of how tight they're holding themselves. So, now, but that's not treatment for trauma. That's trauma-informed teaching, how you teach when you know a lot of stuff. That then would have to be coupled with specific treatment for trauma. There is, in terms of proven practices, RAND evaluated CBIT, cognitive behavioral intervention for, I don't know what the T is, trauma survivors. And this case was actually originally designed for kids who had migrated and gone through, in the process of immigration, really crazy traumatic stuff, but it has been used in broader populations. So, so in that, it's basically cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's provided by, you actually train a teacher or support staff to do it. It's like a 7-session thing. That's one example. Another example are just all of the culturally informed healing circles and healing practices. So there's just there's right now just an explosion of creative ways around treating trauma. So again, there's the three things. There's the trauma-informed teaching that everyone needs to know about, right? Then there's the trauma treatment, and as part of it, then there's the kind of intense partnering that the school's going to need with social service agencies and other providers to do this, because schools can't do it on their own.
All right, great. Thank you for that. And then there were some questions about concerted collective impact models addressing the needs across the system. And then also, so there were two concerted collective impact questions. And the other one is about what it looks like, the collective impact of national, like what implicit bias looks like affecting the
Yeah, let me deal with the first one. The second one's harder. I'd love to think more about that one, and the person who wrote it should definitely email me, because I'd love to talk about it more. What I'm showing right here is, this is a worksheet I've created for communities, okay? What it basically says is, who are your partners who are addressing the different pieces of this, right? What you need to think about is how you guys get, like all of you are dependent on one another. This is the collective action piece, right? So thinking about who's doing the different parts and understanding their connection to one another is crucial in doing this. And if there are gaps, thinking about who fills the gaps. This isn't about one group or one person or one agency doing it all. It's absolutely not about that. People need to go deep in any box that they're in, but they need to understand how what they do impacts the other boxes, and they need to know that other people have the other stuff covered, right? So if we're not thinking, for instance, if we're doing work around mass incarceration, but we're not thinking of the intergenerational lens because we're dealing with grown-ups and they're not in school, we don't really think is that much about their kids, we're not going to think about the impact of mass incarceration or how we take on this part. It's really successful to say, like, hey man, there are bad kids, yeah, but most of the kids aren't bad. We're talking about mostly good kids, and you can go get ahead and do whatever you want with the bad kids, but stop hurting the good kids and stop the minor stuff. That's all that matters. But when you do that, what you're doing is you're really supporting this idea that somehow all the kids in the juvenile justice system, the kids over here, right, and here, are not deserving, right, and that all of them kind of deserve what they get. Right? We need to actually address all of that, because if we don't address those young people, and mind you, one thing I didn't mention, that right in California, this circle right here, it has a kind of what this ends up with before it ends up in dropout, it ends up at alt schools, okay? And alternative schools are the way station. And they have some of the highest suspension rates in the state. And so we're going to work on a report looking just at alternative schools and suspension rates. But it's really, it's saying that somehow we'll solve this problem by taking the really bad kids and putting them all together somewhere does not solve the problem. It just perpetuates these cycles. So that's an example of how folks could work together. And there are places where parts of this is happening, but it's different in different, it's really, really different in different communities, right? So there's lots of this is happening in LA, right? Pieces of this are happening in Long Beach. Lots of this is happening in Oakland. And Oakland's one I know most, but you really see a lot of these boxes happening in Alameda County, right? Chicago, Nashville, New York City, all these different places. But I can't say yet that anyone is approaching it with this particular frame in mind. I think that there are different people doing this work. They're not necessarily understanding themselves all as connected. And on the implicit bias piece, I actually don't know. I would love to talk more about that. Whoever sent that question, and please feel free to email me. I would love to think more, because that is something that seriously is going to need a collective impact approach.
And I shared your email directly with that person, and then I can also share it with everyone.
And then I'll also send this. We'll send this deck out so you can use the piece I have up right now to think about in your community who's doing what.
Yeah. And then someone also and I'll also send out your email. There was someone who would like, and after the answer to your collective impact question, there was they wanted the worksheet that you were talking about. So
yes, totally. This is it right here.
Yeah. And then just as a reminder, because I got a couple more questions about that, we will send out the slides and the Prezi link, and we will also have the webinar available on fixedschooldiscipline.org, and it's also available on our YouTube channel, so you can share it as well. So it seemed like a lot of people were nervous about that, and they're like, we can't lose this info. So don't worry, we will send those out afterwards. And then I know that we have like about 4 more minutes. Someone, and I'm seeing like a couple of last sections of questions are kind of together. So there's a question about learning time being crucial for a student, and so what about alternative schools where that time is very limited? What are some options for those schools to implement positive school reform?
That's such a great question. I'm thinking about that right now and trying to understand it. I don't know if Jorge Ruiz de Velasco is on the line, but I noticed that he's attending, and we can't let him speak. But he wrote an amazing report looking at alt schools, and found some alt schools that were doing really, really amazing stuff. So let's just say that's in process. Please, whoever had that question, email me, because if you're thinking about it, I'd love to team up and think together about. So we need to think both about what system looks best, right? So we don't want a system which is systematically just pushing kids out to something where when you need more, you get less, right? So what system changes, and then with those system changes, then actually what is the model of if that, like, if the being at the mainstream high school is really not working for you and you really need something different, what does it look like for that to be really a rich, robust alternative? Like, my whole thing was like, what if you had kind of college-ready credit recovery? What if you made your alt system like so powerful that people, who were like, going to the exam schools wanted to do it? Like, what does it take to really like create powerful personalized learning options for young people for whom the mainstream system isn't working, but do it in a way that isn't warehousing, that isn't giving people who need more less, that isn't stigmatizing. So email me.
Awesome. Yeah. And there was, by the way, there was I'm so sorry, Shauna. There was a question about a book that you referenced earlier, very early, and I think it was called, there was something with loving in the title. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's Andrew Cherlin, Love's Labor Lost. Okay, and it's about the history of marriage and family forms. It's a great book. Highly recommend it.
And I'm just looking through. There are a lot of thank yous, and I know we have like 1 minute left, so I think we'll go ahead and close now. If for some reason I did not get to your question, I tried to put a couple of them together, but if I didn't get to your question, please just note it again, and I'll send it over to Tia. I will also, if you have any questions, email us at info@sixschooldiscipline.org. And if there are questions for Tia, I'll make sure to send them right over to her. And thank you so much, Tia, for taking the time, and thank you everyone for staying until the end of the day. And so we'll close now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Have a good evening.